Greetings, this is Daoud from Compliance Standards LLC, and welcome to today's podcast. I'm excited to introduce our special guest, Kyle Marks, the founder of Retire IT. With nearly 2 decades of experience, Kyle is clearly a veteran in the IT Asset Disposition sector. In this episode, we'll be diving into the evolution of ITAD, its current challenges, and obviously future opportunities, drawing on Kyle's extensive insights. The ITAD industry, while relatively young, has seen significant movements and transformations over the decades. Kyle, who began his journey with Retrobox before eventually creating Retire IT, is going to share with us how the industry has evolved. We'll be discussing the critical role of ITAD plays in managing the lifecycle of IT assets and why it often remains underappreciated by corporate leaders and CIOs and IT and procurement managers, etc. Key challenges such as awareness and compliance highlighted by high-profile data breaches like the Morgan Stanley incident underscore some of the consequences of non-compliance with ITAD regulation. And Kyle emphasizes the importance of robust internal controls and regular compliance checks to eventually mitigate risks. Additionally, we'll explore opportunities for improvements, including the use of third-party trackers and auditors, enhanced tools and technologies to track assets, greater industry collaboration, for example, proactive measures for data security, and the growing emphasis on sustainability and environmental responsibility. Join us as we unpack these insights and more with Kyle, shedding lights on how companies can navigate the challenges and seize opportunities in the ITAD industry. Kyle, thank you so much for coming today. I am thrilled because you've been in this industry for probably a little over 17 years, if my math works. That's about half the age of the average ITAD company. Average ITAD company is about 35 years. What we did is took 30 companies that are active in the ITAD space, looked at when they were founded. We removed a couple of outliers. HP, for example, has been there since for a long time. Many of these companies have been there. So we removed the outliers. When you take roughly 29 companies, the average is 35. How do you feel at 17 years old? 3 years from now, you'll be 20.
Well, we actually turned 20 in a month. So
you did?
Yes. Next month we have our 20th anniversary, and I got in the industry slightly before that. There was a company called Retrobox that was the original company that became Integra. So that's how I actually got into the industry. So it's been a while for sure.
So I think many of the search engines out there, including ChatGPT, say that you guys were founded in 17 years ago exactly. So you're no longer a teenager. How's the journey so far?
Well, I have to say I've never been more excited. I've always been an optimist. I still, the reason I got into the industry or fell in love with it was because it was fragmented, messy, and it was going to be around for a very long time, for foreseeable future. There was a lot of opportunity. And I would say today I'm, even more optimistic about the prospects. So,
yeah, and it's a weird thing because I do recall when I was literally dragged into this market back in 2003 to give a speech in a conference on the future of devices and technologies. And in the beginning, I sort of dismissed it as like, who is tracking this market? Really, no one. But it turned out to be a much more interesting industry than what I was tracking back then, which is the brand new equipment market. And it is true that it has a lasting effect on you in a sense that even if you try to leave it, at some point you're going to go back to it because it's such an interesting dynamic market. And yet I sense that things haven't really drastically changed since I started covering this space in 2003 in terms of how the sector is perceived by the end user, by large companies. There's certainly traction there. I mean, there's a lot of regulations. There are norms and standards that came out since 2003. There are certifications that have hit the market. And so certainly there is traction in terms of where this industry is moving going forward, but it is still less of importance in the eyes of CIOs, of corporate leaders when you compare it with their commitment to the IT infrastructure in general. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
And so are you witnessing any changes there? And you wrote an entire book on this.
Well, I wrote the book because it allows people to see the issues that, many of us already understand who are in the industry, but, using illustrations, there's a little bit of humor. Illustrations allow you
Brilliant.
to see yourself in it. It's, not, vendor specific. These are general safeguards and issues that we're talking about. But what I certainly, share the sentiment that this is not the top of mind issue for CIOs or CTOs or CISOs. There's only been a handful of significant events, in my mind that have happened over the last 20 years. And, we all talk about them, but we really don't even study them that closely. And, the most, recent, significant one was, the Morgan Stanley breach. And it still isn't that well understood. The two breaches, one got all the coverage, the other I view as far more important. And by its very nature, ITAD was deemed cybersecurity. The SEC said as much. And last December, new cybersecurity regulations went into effect. The SEC. But I would wager that most CISOs, if you ask them if ITAD were cybersecurity, they wouldn't, naturally come to that conclusion, right? It's something that's not, not top of mind. It's not, their daily activity. And so it's an uphill battle to raise awareness and to even get it on the CISO's agenda.
You look at this Morgan Stanley breach, and what you realize is sort of a disconnect between how ITAD is positioned in the ITAM structure. On the one hand, Morgan Stanley spends a little over $7 billion, probably close to $8 billion in its IT infrastructure. And that's absolutely correct. That's the right thing. I mean, the entire technology is basically what really drives the operations of a financial corporation. So IT is absolutely the backbone of a financial services corporation. And so I'm not really surprised that they spend close to $8 billion a year. What is surprising is that at the end of that life cycle, there is very little oversight that leads us to a breach that you have been talking about for a while. That's costing the company $160 million minimum, and probably more. One would argue that compared to a $7-8 billion investment in technology, $160 million is nothing. But it is at the end of the day a lot of money, and it's also a reputational risk. What is it, do you think, that's making companies not so in tune with that particular thing that is end of life, which is absolutely critical? And we can talk about that. Why is it so important in a moment?
Well, I don't think companies have, paid the price for non-compliance. And I'm not saying that, I'm not, hoping they do. But I'm saying that, it's a rational decision not to spend too much time or energy or resources on it if there aren't any consequences for not. And so I believe there's a, kind of a lack of awareness and understanding. You seem to know a lot about Morgan Stanley. If you had to guess, I'm not picking on Morgan Stanley, but just in general, if you ask, an organization, asset managers, how accurate is their inventory? Like what percent of assets at a freeze time could they account for? Best in class. Well, what percent of, assets could a company definitively say they know exactly precisely where it's at? And
look, I mean, we did a number of surveys, and I can tell you that knowledge on where devices are at even physically at any given time is not there for a substantial share of the respondents. I can't remember the exact number, but it is in the double digits for sure, that people that are tasked to, to secure corporate assets, they themselves don't know where those assets are at any given time. Software is making progress for sure. I mean, there's a lot of online
Sure.
tools now that they can use to track that. But to your point, it's not a priority. And
Well,
I think to your point, there's no punishment at the end of the day. It
well,
doesn't cost
there's
anything.
not. I think if privacy advocates would actually understand that, let me just say 85% or 90% is a good number of hardware accuracy. If Morgan Stanley could only account for 90% of its cash, that would be an issue. If a school system could only account for 90% of its students, that would be an issue. If a airline could only account for 90% of its baggage, it would be an issue.
Yeah.
But with hardware asset management, it's a shrug of the shoulders, because it's very hard, right? When a company purchases the assets, by the time they deploy them and put them into use, you're already off by a couple of percentage points, right?
Yeah.
And and IT asset management is a series of check-ins and check-outs, moves, add, changes. I view ITAD as the final checkout, and it's fundamentally different because it's being checked into a third party, and oftentimes there's data at stake. When you buy assets, if you bought 1,000 laptops and only received 999, somebody in procurement would know. They'd notice. They'd cry foul. They'd get the asset or they'd get the credit, but there's no data risk. Fast forward 2 or 3 years and you're retiring them, you might only know where 90% of them are, and then you're tasked with tracking them to the disposal vendor. And this is where the Morgan Stanley case was interesting, not because of what the OCC, Morgan Stanley disclosed, the pair of breaches. The OCC fined them. The class action started and they were consolidated into one because, the federal judge doesn't want to deal with multiple, cases. That settled. And then 2 years later, the SEC gets involved. And the SEC is, the most powerful regulatory body on the planet, arguably. They typically only get involved when somebody drops the dime on somebody, a whistleblower gets involved. They not only, hit Morgan Stanley with another $35 million, they also use the word astonishing, the practices. And if you look at the 8 or 9 things that they said, they were really, blocking and tackling. And one of them, was very common, what we deal with every day, which is a records reconciliation exercise. And most companies don't even do that. They allocate the assets or they share their inventory with the disposal vendor. And if you actually kind of look at the standard trust-based IT asset disposition process, most companies are wildly non-compliant by that very definition, right? And it would behoove organizations to put in place a couple of simple safeguards to bring them into compliance, especially with the SEC. So if there is an unfortunate incident, where there's a whistleblower, they won't be accused of, they won't be defenseless, right? Our goal is to provide defensible disposition, whether it's internal stakeholders, whether it's external auditors or regulators. You have a reasonable, process policy that's understood and followed, and you have the adequate controls in place that's monitored. It can't be the wild, wild west. Eventually compliance will be required to be demonstrated. Right now, it's not. There are very few, if any, tests. When things like, SOX compliance starts dictating, that ITAD be evaluated and tested, and all of a sudden you start getting stakeholders like the fiduciaries, the Deloittes, the PwCs, the KPMGs, the Ernst & Youngs coming in, and they're having to attest and sign off on these practices. Organizations are going to have to get their house in order. there's only been one company that's been put in the penalty box by the SEC.
Yeah.
When that becomes 2 or 3 or 5 or 10, then companies will pay attention, but it might be too late for the average company. And a small incident could become an existential crisis if all of a sudden the plaintiff lawyers decide not to settle. The plaintiff lawyers accepted a $60 million settlement. What if they say, let's take this to the nth degree and say, I don't think this is a quote unquote small number of servers. That's, the 42 servers that were allegedly sent to Arrow, but they couldn't, account for. What if they say, let's look at all the disposal projects, that you've done in the last 10 years or since the beginning of time? And the thing about IT asset management, you mentioned tools a little bit ago. The tools are becoming fantastic. They're very sophisticated.
You bet. Yeah.
It also makes the information readily discoverable, right? You have all this records at your fingertips, the procurement records, the discovery records, and the disposition records. As simple as the SEC called it, a records reconciliation exercise would reveal unaccounted for items or assets. And the question companies need to ask themselves, are those incidents? And I think clearly they are until proven otherwise. If there's no data or if the data has been secured, well, then that incident can be resolved. Otherwise, you have to, take it to the, investigate it. And the SEC, with their regulations said, a material incident must be disclosed within 4 days, being determined it was material. They also fined a company, Blackbaum, because they were trying to claim plausible deniability. And they said that's not the case. You need to have controls in place. You can't say, I didn't know because nobody told me. Management's expected to put controls in place so they know. The other thing is that the immaterial incidents, when they collectively become material, and that by definition can almost be ITAD, because I don't know if you remember, but years ago, we actually did some research together and showed, some tracking data. We looked at several hundred or several thousand projects, and 4 out of 5 projects are missing at least one asset. Now, doesn't mean that they were at the level of breach, but they have to be researched and resolved, right?
Exactly.
If a company isn't doing that and a whistleblower drops the dime on them, or there's an incident that gets out, I don't know what would happen. I mean, I imagine it would be, the penalties become a lot more severe. And that's where, an ounce of prevention is worth, tens of millions or hundreds of millions in cure, right?
Yeah.
When we got into this industry, the big concern was, kind of twofold: environmental and data security. Well, now there's other things. It's, almost anything with an IP address could be a backdoor onto a network, right? There's things that were considered dumb devices are now smart. And, so it's better to, consider almost everything an asset, that could be access or have data. And then I would also say the fourth thing is compliance, because, the SEC pays 30% of up to 30% of a fine. That's incredible motivation for somebody. It could be a disgruntled employee. It could be a frustrated vendor. Anybody that has inside information on your IT asset management or IT asset disposition practices could, file a whistleblower complaint with a couple of clicks. And minimally, there's going to be, kind of a regulatory inquiry. It could become worse, right? If they find, that there's non-compliance and you weren't addressing it. And so, environmental, certainly, from a circularity perspective and, environmental compliance and ESG is always going to be important. We don't want things, found in the wrong place or irresponsibly discarded. Data security is certainly important, but access and compliance are up there as well.
I have to say that not too long ago, I was at an ITAD company's facility, and they actually showed me a batch of devices that they've got, laptops and desktop essentially, that came from an OEM, the OEM being sort of the contract holder on the ITAD side,
Mhm.
where presumably there was not supposed to be any data on those devices, and they were full of banking information. I personally connected with the OEM, and they were completely dismissive, completely not caring about the issue. It was no longer their problem. The devices were being held by their ITAD provider or their service provider. And my question to you, to what extent do you think this problem is widespread? Of course, we've heard of Morgan Stanley. It's a big company. The media, got hold of the information. It's an interesting headline for data security magazines for sure.
Mhm.
But I have a feeling that this is the tip of the iceberg. I mean, what we saw is, to your point, maybe a company that volunteered information in the beginning, perhaps. And is that a widespread practice?
When I read, the disclosure, I think it was, July 9th, I think it was when it was disclosed. My first, question was why? Because if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, did it really happen? Mandatory disclosure laws exist because companies wouldn't voluntarily advertise, problems like this.
Shortcomings, yeah.
Yeah, and so clearly there was something that was, that was going to be coming out. And if you look at there were two breaches. One, was they got a lot more attention, where, assets were remarketed with data on it. Now they actually went through several vendors' hands, including an e-steward, before it got to the end user who bought it. And then, Morgan Stanley, made a series of missteps. The other question that came to mind was, why did they disclose two breaches that happened at two different periods of time, at the same time? And I'm not, gonna, we could speculate about that, but it was, they also said that they were going to be, holding vendors accountable, and that they had, terminated an employee that was, largely responsible for these things.
Mhm.
Again, one could give Morgan Stanley a lot of credit for coming forward, and disclosing these things, or was it going to come out anyways? So right now, historically, exposure for an organization has been tied to disclosure. Disclosure is voluntary, and most companies will do everything they can to avoid disclosure naturally. But now, that you mentioned this, the contract holder was an OEM. They have skin in the game, right? So if
Absolutely.
they know about an incident and didn't disclose that to the enterprise, the covered entity, that whose data it was, they could have liability. There's certainly,
I am speculating that basically they were acting as a transit point without, looking at those devices. Essentially, they probably didn't care. They have the customer on one hand, they have the ITAD processor on the other hand. They were sort of just in the middle. They wouldn't really, even though they have their own facilities, by the way, they take possession of those devices. They do whatever they do, then they push them to an ITAD company. I think they were not aware that this was happening. What was shocking to me is their response. It's radio silence in most cases, and they probably counted on the ITAD processor to do the work on their behalf. But the ITAD processor was pushing back because it was not part of their contract. And
to
sort of,
wipe the data. Is
yeah,
that
and exactly. So they were doing some other things. So the problem is, damn if we do, damn if we don't, right? Because we're not being paid to do it, and yet this is a big customer, and we can't just turn our back on them. And so it creates all of these weird sort of environment. And the question is, at the end of the day, it's not necessarily that the executives in IT departments and compliance, etc., are careless about it or they don't care. I'm sure they do care at the end of the day. It's the process that's broken. There is no stakeholder, or there is no one in the IT department, for example, on the enterprise side, that's touching those devices, responsible for their end of life, who is equipped, skilled, educated to do what ought to be done, which is not, at the end of the day, ITAD is not an IT operation, is it?
First and foremost, assets a financial term, right? I mean, so, and, I would think most executives expect or hope, that, every asset can be tracked from acquisition through disposition. And I do think they would be shocked if they understood, it can't, that a significant portion of hardware assets, go unaccounted for. There's also, you mentioned that there's not accountability, right? I mean, it took a financial crisis before, GAAP standards were put in place, before, bookkeeping matured to become, financial accounting. There's no CFO in the world today would even question the need for independent auditing, right? The fox can't watch the hen house. In a lot of organizations, the very person responsible for the asset life cycle of the assets, also responsible for disposition. That is a conflict of interest, because there's only pain and potential problems if they report problems, or at least that's the perception, right? If that expectation is that they can account for everything from acquisition through disposition, what it's rational. Why would an asset manager raise their hand and say we can't do it? If it would take a very brave soul. And so the governance is completely wrong, right? You literally need to separate, duties. And that is also a major element of every single data security, law there is, right? That's the first thing that, auditors come in and look at is, was there a conflict of interest or a conflict of duty? And so that's where I say right out of the gate, most companies are wildly non-compliant because the incentives are entirely wrong. You're rewarded for sweeping problems under the rug as opposed to surfacing them. And asset managers are not magicians. They're not physically touching every asset all the time. They rely on resources and technicians, and they can't snap their fingers and make IT or contractors do all this work for them. If people aren't updating systems, that's a big problem. Then they're flying blind. They can only do so much. And so it should not be, asset managers should not be blamed. In a lot of ways, they're victims of this situation. But they're also the ones that get blamed when something's found in the wrong place or found with data on it. So they do need to speak up. And there needs to be, I've written, that I think hardware asset management's far more difficult than financial accounting, right? A dollar is a dollar. It's fungible. An asset is different. It is a unique identifier. It's you can't just swap out like for like kind. So I don't think hardware asset management gets the respect. I know it doesn't get the respect it deserves. It's crucially important. Back to something you said earlier, because companies have not paid the price, they haven't done anything about it. It's not rocket science. I mean, if you ask asset managers, if you were given an unlimited budget, if you were given the resources, given the mandate, and you had the support of an organization, could you track all the hardware? Absolutely. Right.
Yep. And it's not, like you said, it's not rocket science.
It's not rocket science. So just literally there's a lack of interest or discipline. And so it could result from sort of the mother of all disclosures happening before companies actually wake up.
Yes.
The next, I feel sorry for the next Morgan Stanley. I use that as the next company, because I don't believe the plaintiffs are going to stop at a simple settlement. Yeah. These issues have now been, understood. The SEC has called them astonishing, right? There's also the gatekeepers, which is what the SEC calls the fiduciaries, the independent auditors, what they explicitly say, they rely on them, for attestation and looking at controls and practice. So I see a scenario where the next Morgan Stanley type of event results not only in an extremely expensive, time-consuming, painful process, that goes far beyond the isolated incident, where basically asset management is put on trial. I think it's also going to extend to those who should have been evaluating and attesting, testing the controls and evaluating it, because they're signing off on it, right? Does a company have reasonable, adequate controls? And I also see, depending on the size of the penalty, and I also see shareholders becoming interested. I'm old enough to remember when Enron left a 50 some billion dollar hole in our economy. It was because not only was there a lot of fraud involved and a lot of cover up, it was also being swept under the rug, and there was a there used to be the Big Eight, became the later became the Big Four, and Arthur Andersen doesn't exist anymore, right? So when there is a disclosure, it's a rush to the courthouse. I can't remember exactly how many there were, when Morgan Stanley disclosed, but it's also usually oftentimes the first to file, gets appointed to, the lead plaintiff.
Mm-hmm.
And, now, there's already a playbook of, what they're looking at, what they're looking for, even more so now that the SEC has come out and said these things. So either a company should be taking steps to, put safeguards in place and modernize and professionalize this business activity that happens every single day. Companies run on technology. Hardware is vital, right? Or they're just crossing their fingers, hoping that it's not them. I don't have to be faster than the bear, just faster than my fellow camper, right? I mean, that's not really the best way to look at this. Does that make sense?
Oh, no, absolutely. Look, I think there are huge expectations about what an ITAD operation within an enterprise ought to do. And the responsibilities that ITAD has, and by ITAD, I mean here ITAD in an enterprise. So that these are folks in IT management, etc., versus the skill sets and the resources that they have are completely mismatched, right? Completely mismatched. We have an end of life that is loaded in terms of data security risk, as we've been talking about the past 30 minutes. We have an end of life that is arguably the most loaded in terms of environmental risk in the entire chain of ITAM. Where else would you be more exposed environmentally than in the ITAD space, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not during the procurement, it's not during the management of those assets, it's at the end of life. It's an area where we're talking about secondary markets, which means now we have to have visibility on pricing in the secondary market. We have to have visibility on financial issues. We have to have a clear understanding of things that your IT management is not skilled to do. And so my point being, is it possible that this mismatch means that corporations are not, have to create a different set of job skills that would ensure that they are complying with all the regulations, be they on the data security front, be they on the environmental front, be they optimizing operations so that there's no disruptions? Are we at that stage where basically the staffs involved in ITAD in enterprise are not, ready for this? They need more resources, but more importantly, really more skills to get things done.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm an asset manager. I mean, I'm a consultant. I believe it's, the most, it deserves more recognition, more resources. You can't, do this without, half the time, companies contact us, find us on the internet. ITAD's not even a budgeted activity, right?
Mm-hmm.
They fundamentally, don't understand, the costs. And it's, they hope the value of the equipment, pays for the services required, so they do break even or better. So companies don't even budget for it properly. But to the point about the skill set and the way, I believe it's IT asset disposition management's fundamentally different than asset
ITAM.
management. Yeah, and ITAM, right? It needs to be done by two different people. In outsourcing is different than managing. Clearly the company would be irresponsible if it didn't work with an R2 or eSteward enterprise, but just by working with one of them does not guarantee compliance. Far from it. And not all R2 certified processors are created equal. In fact, these standards, permit things, that, I believe that's literally just the base case. That gives you some assurance that they're not illegally shipping things or burying stuff in the backyard or chucking it in a landfill. But these are, that compliance, and nobody was happier when these environmental standards, industry standards were put forward, because before that, I had to go visit every facility. I had my own checklist of the things that I was looking for before I felt comfortable in working with one of these vendors. I was very happy that the industry got together and agreed on some basic, things. But that, there's a difference. The easy part is selecting the qualified vendor. The hard part is managing it. No vendor can protect an asset it doesn't receive. And that's what gets companies in trouble, right? If you're doing things like sharing your inventory with a vendor and expecting them to do the cross-check and reconciliation, you've just put them in harm's way, and you've demonstrated your lack of understanding in terms of compliance. If I were an ITAD, and a client wants to give you their inventory, I would say, thank you. You can give it to us, but we're not going to look at it, because there should not be an expectation that we're going to vouch that everything's here. We will inventory everything, we'll report what we have, but that going back and reconciling, and anybody who's ever reconciled knows how difficult it is. That can't be done. Again, teachers shouldn't give answers to the student and expect them to grade their own tests. Yeah. And so if I were an ITAD, I would say that is not our business. We can either, hire a third party to do it for us, and so we can sit on the same side of the table together, or we can provide it to you. But I see this as a huge opportunity for ITADs, providing additional services and going, you mentioned the book. I mean, I think it is fundamental that a company, that processors receive and hold the equipment. 99% of inventory problems can be cleared up if you get a second look at the equipment. If you receive and go ahead and push the stuff down the line, it gets recycled or broken down or refurbished and resold, you're never going to get a second look at the equipment, right? And so, ITAD should be offering these services to help their clients become compliant, right? It's a value add, optional premium service that they can be offering, and they should be a partner, and they should operate like a fiduciary, right, which is, where you're operating in the best interest of the client. That means telling them what they need to hear, not necessarily what they want to hear, right? Because if there is another Morgan Stanley type of event and it is discovered that, the processor, the ITAD, was complicit in kind of concealing the problems, that company's probably out of business.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's existential.
You've defined the problems and the issues in general, and what would be some of the basic steps you would recommend, let's say, for those viewers who either are new to this, work for an IT department, for procurement, for ESG, for whatever, for a corporate, on the corporate side, or may already have a program, but again, witnessing what's been happening, looking at so the changes taking place in the industry, looking at the impact of ESG and other things. What are the steps you would recommend for them to follow?
Well, first and foremost, most of the metrics that are, I'd define what success means. What are the metrics we're going to measure? And, most of the metrics in our industry are what I call vanity metrics. They come down, how many, what's the impact from a, ESG perspective? I'm talking more about the metrics that drive performance and success, and starting with chain of custody. right? And if you're not tracking something, if you're not measuring it, you're not managing it, right? So how do you define chain of custody? How are you measuring it? Oftentimes when there's something that's untracked, I would argue it's an incident. Most companies don't even look at incidents or catalog incidents when it comes to this. So the second thing I would do is I would define all the incidents. Now we have a database, I've tracked over 140 different things that can happen. Most people can think of a handful off the top of their head. If something's found in the wrong place or found with data on it, if a driver steals something, these are very basic handful of scenarios. There's a lot of scenarios, and so defining the instance, what can happen, and then what can we do to mitigate these things, and then what's the incident response. These are things that are irrespective of the vendor. Before you even entertain, doing an RFP and selecting a vendor, you have to get your house in order. So looking at metrics, looking at, what incidents are in place, and then developing your process. And your process should be independent of the processor, because in our industry, vendors, can become unresponsive. They can go out of business. There's a lot of things. And, maybe you have a policy of doing an RFP every 2 or 3 years. Your process should not change every time you want to add a vendor or change a vendor, right? And so, again, it's the science of managing ITAD that is lacking, right?
Right.
Anybody can pick a qualified vendor. How you manage it is far more important. And it's independent.
And from your perspective, who is the best suited to do that in the enterprise? Who is that person who has to sit down and reimagine or fix the way ITAD works? Is there a particular title, or is all over the map?
It's all over the map. And honestly, asset managers are phenomenal at it, but they can't report to the same person. So it's not necessarily the title. It's also where it reports into, right? So it could be under procurement. It could be, under cybersecurity, honestly, is where, if you look at where the resources are, that is cybersecurity. Companies are spending a boatload of money.
Yes.
And, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, where asset managers are often, reluctant, to report an incident, because they fear consequences. Whereas you talk to a cybersecurity person, they literally brag about how many incidents they had to handle that day or that hour or that minute, right? And we're scared to even, discuss what could possibly be defined as an incident, right? And so that's a great question. I would say, I hope my book allows the conversation to flourish, right? To start the conversation. I don't think there's any one way to do it. It could fall under IT procurement or IT finance. It could fall under cybersecurity. It could fall under, IT. It could be a business analyst. It should not be the same person that's responsible, for managing the life cycle.
Yeah. My position, Kyle, has been you have to have a champion, a skilled, call it an ITAD analyst, who is generally housed in the IT department, because the IT department tends to sort of have the technical ownership of the device, even though in a lot of cases the devices are owned by the business unit or etc. But they are sort of the gatekeepers, if you will. So an ITAD specialist that is not necessarily just tied to ITAD. He could be doing a bunch of other things within the IT department. So it's not necessarily a dead weight on the IT department's budget. That person would champion the end of life of IT equipment by interfacing with all of the stakeholders, whether they are on the ESG front, on the finance side, on the compliance and legal front, all of that, having that additional skill set of knowing all of the above is required. It doesn't have to be a master's in finance, but understanding the secondary market and how prices are set, and what to ask and how to determine the life of a device within the primary life cycle to generate perhaps better revenue in the secondary market. All of that, to me, ought to be housed within the IT department with an an ITAD analyst who has this mandate to look at support within and across the organization. To me, sort of that's probably the most sensitive thing to do without breaking the bank.
I definitely think it needs to be, there has to be a point person. I definitely think there needs to be a bigger, broader team, because obviously there's, governance, risk, compliance, there's, sort of the ESG, there's a lot of stakeholders, and they should certainly meet to establish the policies, establish the objectives, and they should meet, periodically to review the results. I'm an advocate of an independent, third party manager doing this, because it allows the rest of the team to sit on the same side of the table along with the vendor, right? Now, there are certain individuals or certain parties that are conflicted, and they can't play that role, right? So clearly the ITAD itself can't do it, and the asset manager managing the lifecycle can't do it. So by definition, it has to be somebody else. But there should also be, a kind of a do, review, approve. You can't have an individual, sweeping problems under the rug. So there has to be multiple parties involved. This is where those sort of reconciliation exercises, if you don't have a standard way to do it, if you're literally doing it in spreadsheets, that's not scalable. It's not reliable. If David did it and Kyle wanted to proof it, I would have to redo the same thing, and I'd probably come up with the same, different results. So you got to get out of the spreadsheets, and you got to get into, a very defined protocol, right? A consensus protocol, and whether David does it or Kyle does it or somebody else does it, we all get the same results each and every time. I've also written about the fact that, incidents, when they're detected right away, there's kind of a golden hour of ITAD. And it's, kind of taken from when there's a crisis, that first hour means oftentimes the difference between life and death. We're not first responders, but the same concept, if you identify an issue right away, it usually can get resolved, right? And if you have the process and procedures in place, you can pinpoint it and certainly neutralize the problem. Oftentimes it becomes a non-event. What happened with Morgan Stanley, if you believe what was said, it was a significant amount of time had lapsed, right? When a subsequent inventory was done, or reconciliation was done after Arrow announced it was leaving the industry, right? That reconciliation should have been done the day the equipment was received, right? And then if there's a problem, it gets fixed right away, not a year later, not a month later, not a week later, because you could have resolved. And if you've been inside of a lot of facilities, Arrow was phenomenal. They were very tight, very well certified. I could make a strong argument that those assets were never lost, those 42 servers. Because if David and Kyle were working at the Arrow facility that day, I'm working on one client, one pallet of equipment, David's working on another. I take something off, I put it on the floor as I'm unpacking it, you trip on it, you think you put it down, you put it on your pallet, that asset is not lost. It's lost in the building and lost from reporting. And unless somebody's on top of it right away, it probably will not get corrected, right? And you can't wait a year to do that, because those assets would be long gone. And so there's a lot of things from the management of ITAD that if somebody knows what they're doing, can mitigate these risks. Right? And again, it goes back to the interest and the appetite of senior management. Nobody became a CIO because they focused on ITAM or ITAD. Nobody became a CTO because they focused on ITAM or ITAD, right? It is, but it becomes critically important. Nobody cares about ITAD until everybody cares, and then it's too late, right? And so I'm urging people to take, some simple practical steps now, so they avoid a lot of pain, later.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I do agree with you. We do surveys that question companies on what are their sources of learning. What do they learn? Where do they learn about ITAD?
Mhm.
Who influences them? And the striking responses, Kyle, is the preeminent position of the ITAD vendor. ITAD vendors, because there's no other sources of educating folks in the enterprise, they lean heavily on the ITAD company to teach them a number of things, including, ironically, a description of the competitive landscape, which to me, you don't ask a company to describe their competitive landscape because they have a stake in ensuring that they are defined as the best company out there. So I completely agree with you that there is the need for third-party folks that would be out in there to help these companies deal with their ITAD needs. And in addition to obviously having an educated staff that knows how to understand the various aspects of IT asset disposition, they don't have to do most of the work. They can sort of outsource a number of that as consulting, if you will, and that would make sense. Two more questions, if you may. The first is related to your company. I would love to know more about what you're doing, and the second one is about your book. So let's begin with your company. What you offer. This is again a message for end users who may not know your company, and would like to know what Kyle is managing.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. And we go to great lengths, in the book and stuff to be, vendor agnostic. I started Retire IT to be a cost savings, to be a cost play. The original concept was to be more like AAA than a tow truck, or more like Travelocity than the airline. It didn't make sense, economically, to ship things around the country. Certainly, it increased the likelihood things would be lost, stolen, or damaged in transit. And so, keeping things in state, with a network of certified processing partners, that was the goal, right? I immediately recognized a bigger issue because of chain of custody. I would, a client would give me their inventory and I'd pick up 100 laptops and we'd get a corresponding report from my downstream vendor. And I'd try to reconcile it, and I couldn't, it wouldn't make sense. Only 2/3 of the serial numbers would match. I couldn't prove definitively.
Yeah.
I had moved around the country enough times that some of my furniture had moving tags, and so I had an idea. I bought a label printer. I started printing barcodes, and I started sending them to my client. And they look like this,
Yeah.
and simple stickers. And I'd ask my clients to sticker the equipment before we scheduled a pickup. And then I told my downstream partners that I wouldn't pay them unless they scanned the barcodes. And of course, it's easier to scan a barcode than capture a serial number. So they were actually pretty happy about that. And all of a sudden, we were tracking, virtually 100%. I had to write a lot of software because now you're dealing with what I call two-key tracking. And there's a lot of different scenarios. At the end of the day, Retire IT is a technology-enabled process. We operate like a company's IT disposal department, if they ever had one. We sit between a company and the vendors that do the processing, and we have a very defined process to make sure everything is accounted for in a very standardized, systematic way. And we do a lot of services. Because certainly with COVID, there was a lot of work from home people, so we've rolled out a QR code program with FedEx, so it's like a no box, no label, almost like an Amazon return. And most of the time we're doing standard pickups, right? And we rely exclusively, probably the only person in the industry that's not trying to get my hands on an asset. We never touch them, we never see them. So 100% is done by trusted partners. And I love working with my partners because unlike say a third party freight company where it's sort of a mixed bag, where a driver might not know the difference between a toaster and a server, good ITADs have trained, crew, and they can navigate environments, get in and out with minimal disruption. They can do a lot of other value add services, but at the end of the day, we manage the process for a company. We also have a subscription service for a couple of clients where we call it disposal desk, where they literally, all of the requests come through us. We have very defined ways of handling it, but they have a help desk, they have a service desk. We operate like their disposal desk. And one of our clients called us that, and so we kind of coined the phrase. And we actually will work with other vendors if they already have them in place. But at the end of the day, we have there's a manifest record of every single disposal event that occurred. And that's required by RCRA and CERCLA, from back to the sort of environmental piece, right? If a company's getting rid of more than, I think it's 220 pounds of covered waste in a calendar month, which is nothing, they have to have a manifest record of all of it, right?
Absolutely.
And look at what happened to Home Depot in California. A few boxes of e-waste, in a dumpster behind a store cost them $27 million, right?
Right.
And so putting this sort of disposal desk approach in place saves a lot of problems down the road.
So you are in some sense what I would coin as a operating system. You are not necessarily handling the devices themselves. What's what's your connection with the processor side? I mean, I'm assuming you have
we're paying clients, so we pay our bills and rely on them. We add a couple of steps, like they have to receive and hold the equipment for a day so we can confirm we have it all. No, but we work exclusively with certified processors. And
how do you gain access to the outcome of their work that you have then to probably report back to your customer?
Our software, we have the expected inventory from the client. We get the receiving inventory, the actual inventory from the processor, and our software does the reconciliation, right? And so we're kind of the middleware between a company's asset repository and a processor's, ERP system or reporting system like, Razor or Maker or some homegrown system. And because we do it in such a systematic, standardized way, we have a plugin with, say, for instance, ServiceNow. If you took a direct feed, from a vendor and tried to update records in ServiceNow, it wouldn't work, right? Because you have to reconcile it, and you have to have all kinds of business rules. And so the fact that we've reconciled it makes it a lot easier to update the status, and
absolutely.
From an end user perspective, they should not retire an asset until they have the receipt, until they have the report, right? And it should go into a status like pending disposal, or until you've reconciled it, right? So yes, we're middleware. We're the an ITAD operating system.
So a client of yours, when they host a processor, are these processors introducing themselves as ITAD company XYZ, or are they introducing themselves as?
We orchestrate it. No, I mean, we schedule. There's over 120 steps in our standard process.
Okay.
Scheduling a pickup. So no, we're quarterbacking the whole thing. Our clients know who's coming. They know when they're coming. Oftentimes we're having to provide a lot of information, but it is the ITADs that's showing up on behalf of Retire IT.
Interesting.
And they also, we protect our vendors as well. I mean, I don't know if you recall, but it was 2013. I wrote an article for Harvard Business Review. You can still Google it. It's the most overlooked part of data security, is what the title was. And that's a true story. And what we didn't reveal is that the vendor was accused. We'd worked with this bank and done lots of pickups with them, and we determined that right away that a couple assets were missing. The client or the vendor quarantined the equipment, re-inventoried it. We didn't ask them to do anything else. We didn't tell them what was going on. We went back to our client, told them what was happening. You can read the article, but bottom line is a veteran of the bank loses her job because she took the assets for her daughter's school, I think it was. It was weeks later we told the vendor what had happened, that their driver was accused of stealing, that they said he looked nervous. I think his name was Steve. And the vendor, actually, when I told the owner of the ITAD, that Steve, the driver, had been accused, he was like,
No
he was
way.
shocked. He said, this guy's like the deacon in his church. I mean, he's like the most honest, nicest, trustworthy guy ever.
Yeah,
But when somebody's trying to sweep a problem under the rug, they're going to throw everybody else,
exactly.
overboard. Yeah. And, so we protect our vendors, because again, 99% of problems happen before a vendor is involved. I don't
Exactly.
want to be accused, and I certainly don't want my partners to be accused of some wrongdoing. And so they're tasked with capturing an inventory, nothing more, nothing less from that, from a reporting perspective. Tell us what we need to hear, not what we want to hear.
I guess my next question is, are you guys the only ones that are doing this? With the exception of the OEMs, because the OEMs have the relationship with their large customers, and therefore they're there to sort of coordinate all ITAD operations.
I don't know if the OEMs do what we do. I don't believe they do.
Well, I mean,
From what I'm
it's
told, they have a process. They're very good at vetting the vendors, but in terms of managing the ITAD, I foresee a problem. If you trust an OEM, you put all your eggs in one basket, and literally, they're orchestrating the ITAD for you, and they're not putting these controls in place. If there's another Morgan Stanley type of event, naturally the client would say, hey, we trusted you to cross the T's, dot the I's, to alert us that there's a problem. What do you mean? How did this happen? Right.
yeah.
And so it is, at the end of the day, the end user is responsible. You can't outsource responsibility.
No.
But there may be a day when the vendors, the OEMs might say, look, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. We don't want to have all of our clients suing us. It's hard. It is very difficult to do IT asset disposition management, right?
Yeah.
And it's easy to pick the vendor. It's difficult to manage the process. And if they're just kind of throwing it over the wall, farming it out to vendors and, providing a report and a certificate, that's not adequate, right?
Right.
And they should be advising their clients at least, to be doing it themselves. A certificate isn't worth the paper it's printed on, and they're all digital anyways. A certificate is a participation trophy. It's the data behind it, right? And again, so, these OEMs and these solution providers, where in the past it's been okay, almost every system integrator, VAR, solution provider has somebody,
Right.
that handles ITAD because they have a couple of relationships. They know somebody who knows somebody. They can get a pickup to take place, and that's not really,
The ultimate solution for sure. Yeah. No, I'm just saying that, at the end of the day, though, I mean, a number of these OEMs, the leasing and financing companies,
sure,
are responsible for bringing back those devices, whether it's a 3 year later because of the end of a lease cycle, or whether they have a services contract that requires them to take those devices. At the end of the day, they do sort of hold the hand of the end user customer, and so they're important in the way sort of they approach the end user customer. And but going back to my question, though, you're a channel, you're an additional channel to the ITAD programs. Are there many companies like yours, like you? I know there are a number of ITAD companies, probably upward of 1,000 or more in the US, but you're the only one that I know that has this unique business platform where essentially you are holding the hands of both of the ITAD and the customer. So that's, to me, that's kind of a one specific channel. Is that channel developed, or are you the only one that you're
oh no,
aware that is doing?
it's a niche, that we and I think a lot of our clients misunderstood. We have people who have used us every year for the last 20 years, right? And it's and they think we are the recycler, right? It's in some way, but I don't own a truck, I don't own a shredder, I don't own a warehouse. If I turned this camera and you looked outside my office, you'd see a handful of people, doing reconciliations and spreadsheets or orchestrating pickups, right? my office looks more like a law firm than the
Yeah.
ITAD
So,
facility.
so I would qualify you as an ITAD management consultant
Yes.
more than an ITAD company, if that makes
We're
sense.
and we're really the software does a lot of the heavy lifting. Our process does a lot of the heavy lifting. Um, and we're even though we certainly preference and have contracts with a number of really great ITAD partners we have
Of
for
course.
years, if a company is working with one and they've established a great working relationship and they're we could certainly take over that relationship and manage it, right? It's you know that has happened, and we've been introduced to some great processing partners because a client said, we've done an RFP, we've picked this company, but we want to use your tags, we want these reports, and so we've inherited those. That's certainly the exception, not the norm.
Right, right.
But yeah, we view ourselves as a process.
Final question, Kyle. Your book, I saw I think even you have a YouTube video on it. Brilliant the way you put it. I mean, it's clearly meant to do two things, in my opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong. One is to simplify the explanation of what the issue is, make it very simple, and two, speak specifically to the people that are in charge of IT asset disposition. Specifically, the last book is about data security. Does that make sense? Is that
Yeah.
what are your goals in putting together this piece?
Well, wasn't that long ago when I was doing a presentation. I used a handful of illustrations,
Yeah.
and somebody asked me, have you ever thought about putting this into a book or a booklet? And I thought, no. I mean, I've been using illustrations for quite some time, and it took a lot longer because there's copy next to every illustration, and I probably have twice as many. There's a lot I left on the cutting room floor. I wanted to simplify, the issues. I wanted it to be timeless. I wanted it to be, to illustrate there's also a solution if you put a couple of simple safeguards in place, use tags, two key tracking,
Yep.
have an equipment verification holds, and segregation of duties, which are vendor agnostic. But yeah, no, I appreciate it. I've actually got a sort of working on a second book that's won't happen for a while. But
That's awesome.
but no, the illustrations are fun, and like I said, I hope it sparks conversation, right?
Yeah.
I almost wish I didn't call it a book because people think it's a heavy lift. I mean,
Right.
honestly, you could read it in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Leave your phone, you know, you know, and pick up the book, and you can finish it in 5 minutes. I like the fact that some people have like literally sent me pictures of them and have notes on every page, and they said they bought a copy that they could give to somebody because they'd mark up theirs. I think that's wonderful, right? And I've had somebody say, what would be great is if you did it where it's like a book where you created something where it's like an exercise where it's like come up with your own caption, and that would be a facilitated discussion. Like, look at this illustration. What does it say to you? And it would be, so there's a lot of utility, and I did that video. I hate hearing myself speak, right? I mean, this is, I think everybody does, but I particularly don't like hearing myself speak. And, I wanted to make a video. And so it's such cool tools out there. So I literally found an
Absolutely.
AI agent that would read it, and I could pick a voice that sounds like yours, or,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it was neat. I mean, like literally within a couple hours, and it can summarize in 8 minutes. So it was kind of cool to do that. But
So it took you a couple hours to put it together?
well, I had the content already.
Oh, okay, you did have the content. Okay, so it's really putting it together was quick because of AI.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I mean, you have to figure out what to do because there's roughly 30 some pages, but yeah, it didn't take very long to stitch it together. I found an AI that trained on my voice. So it took a couple of podcasts and webinars that I'd done, And so I have a version of it which is me reading it.
The last question that I have is a lot of what you've been doing, a lot of what the ITAD sector has been doing, a lot of what everybody has been doing is going to be challenged by AI without any doubt. We are in the business of information, and boy, I think information is the first target of AI. How do you integrate that? First, are you worried about that? And I'm assuming you are looking more at it as an opportunity than a risk. That's the way I look at it, by the way, Kyle. I look at it as an opportunity.
Interesting. I don't view it as an issue for what we do because, we spend an awful lot of time scheduling, confirming, reconfirming, literally these activities, like almost like a travel agent, the reconciliation. We have a very set procedure, to get the information into the database. I mean, if you came to work, one of the first things I'd do is you'd be doing reconciliations, and we teach you how to turn a spreadsheet into it's a process and it's very defined. But the goal is, whether David does it or Cass does it or Kyle does it or Francis does it, it's going to be the same. And so AI would not easily replace that. Now, where I see AI being tremendously valuable is for hardware asset managers, because most companies have a couple dozen discovery tools, right? They have these data lakes of assets. It's like, and how do you normalize? It's like, and so I'm assuming these platforms and these asset management tools are doing a better job of getting to be that single pane of glass pane of truth, right? Where it's most companies, I mean, they don't know where 20% of their assets are. They're not even sure if their CMDB is accurate, right? It's like, and it's like, so, unleash the bots to go out there and be compiling, stuff from SCCM and from, all these different tools, and then normalizing it and making it actionable. I definitely see some use for that. I don't see it being, and maybe, I could show you what our ServiceNow app looks like. This is not AI, but we had to come up with rules. So the mathematical discipline is called combinatorics. And when you're dealing with just serial numbers, you have like three scenarios. It was expected and received, which is perfect. It was expected but not received. That's a problem. It was not expected but received, and you have something extra, right? There's only three scenarios. You introduce two keys, a tag and a serial number. Now there are so many, scenarios, because there can be mismatches and other things that happen.
Right.
We've defined it down to about 18 or 19.
Wow.
Think of it like, the old Price is Right, game on TV, where you go up and you drop a puck and it bounces down and will end up in one slot or another.
Yep.
It's called a data state. Every single asset a company says they're getting rid of is going to end up in one of these data states. Has to, by definition. Mutually exclusive, collectively exhausted. Kind of what I showed you when we did our analysis a decade or so ago. Same thing. I mean, very precise language. When you've done that reconciliation, like in ServiceNow, when we pull that in, you could say, okay, a perfect match, we'll call it retired. We're 100% confident, tag and serial number match. A logical match where we have the tag and the serial number is nearly perfect. The 8 might be a G or the 8 might be a B, but it's a logical match. Again, let it update. But then you start getting into mismatch type 2 or mismatch type 3. And then you might say, we want an asset manager to make a judgment call. Is that the right asset? It's the tag doesn't match and the serial number doesn't match, but they're both Dell, ProLiant, whatever. It's like, and then certainly if something is missing or untracked, it could easily be identified as an incident that, security's on it right away. Did it get left behind? Is it, anyways, the business logic could be improved a little bit with AI. For instance, fuzzy matching, which is a term, for imprecise matching, where you might have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 B. You could come up with an index, a score that would say, yeah, we're 99% sure that's the right. That is the asset, right? And so have I done that? No. Ours is very rudimentary. It's like an index, right? It's like 75% of the characters match. It's a crutch, it's a tool, but I don't have endless resources. But if I had a data scientist and AI, I could literally have an index, it would be like probabilistic. Yeah. Again, that's not where the juice, I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. Most companies are still struggling with getting their procurement data into their CMDB.
Yeah, imagine that.
Right? It's insane. It is going to be the mother of all disclosures.
Yeah.
And, I obviously didn't put this in the book, but how can privacy advocates not be aware of this? It's a bigger thing. They're worried about Mark Zuckerberg's, comments in a congressional hearing. They're worried about AI. They should be worried the fact that companies can't account for 20% of the hardware. Because how can a company credibly claim to be protecting data if it doesn't know where the hell the hardware is? Right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's the dilemma of what it is.
But I honestly think it's because the problem is so big.
Yeah, widespread.
It's so widespread. No one individual can handle it all. It requires IT, it requires procurement, it requires cyber, it requires, vendors, it requires, everybody to get together. And unless there is a mandate, it's just not going to happen. And it's kind of like, it's an open secret. Everybody agrees. Everybody who's commented sent me messages like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you wrote that book. Right? You can't believe you said these things. But everyone's like, yeah, it is what it is. I mean, if you were a privacy advocate, you'd be like, what do you mean 20% of like,
yeah,
you would think they would be, freaking out about that, the implications, but they're not. And it's either because it's just sort of this cognitive dissonance. They can't, hold those competing thoughts in their head at the same time because it is such a widespread problem.
And with that, Kyle, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. And hopefully we'll have more of these discussions going forward.
Absolutely. Enjoyed it.